You know how sometimes you really want to get your head around a complex topic, get the real substance, but without getting lost in endless jargon or feeling like you're cramming for an exam?
Yeah, finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. That's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive, sort of take the heavy lifting out of staying informed for you.
And today, we're really diving into a document that could have some, well, pretty significant consequences. It's called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise.
Hmm.
And this isn't just, theory. It's a detailed plan from the 2025 Presidential Transition Project. It actually echoes the original Mandate for Leadership from back in '81, the one that really shaped the Reagan administration's early days.
Right, a historical precedent there. And it's comprehensive, isn't it? We're talking recommendations touching almost every single part of the federal government.
Oh, absolutely. It covers a huge amount of ground.
So our mission for you, the learner, is to kind of pull out the core themes, the really big proposed shifts, so you get the essence of this document, its vision, without getting totally bogged down in the weeds of policy detail.
Think of it as getting that informed perspective on what could be a major change in direction for how America is governed.
Okay, so where does it start?
Yeah.
The document kicks off with a pretty stark view, doesn't it? Something about decline.
It does. It states right up front that, in its view, the political establishment and cultural elite have once again driven America toward decline. Strong words.
Yeah, sets a definite tone.
But then it immediately pivots to a more optimistic countervision. It says, we know the way out, and it explicitly references that Reagan era, saying, we did it before and we'll do it again. So there's this real conviction, a belief in past conservative approaches being the solution now.
Okay, so building on that sense of urgency and looking back to past models, let's dig into this overarching philosophy a bit more.
Yeah.
What are the main pillars they're building on to tackle this decline they see? What are the big levers they want to pull?
Well, they really center on four key areas. First is rescuing kids. That seems to focus on family well-being, cultural influences on children, things like that.
Okay.
Second, reclaiming culture. That's obviously broader, addressing societal values, norms.
Okay.
Third is reviving the economy, hitting those core conservative economic ideas.
Right.
And the fourth one is pretty direct, defeating the anti-American left at home and abroad. So it frames our political opponents as, well, a fundamental challenge to American ideals.
Those are definitely some big picture categories. Let's maybe zoom in on that first one, rescuing kids. What specific kinds of things are they proposing when it comes to families?
Yeah, it's interesting. The document explicitly says that just, throwing government money at the symptoms of family problems is basically a dead end. Instead, the argument is for actively using federal power, federal policy, to, in their view, strengthen families. A big phrase is elevating family authority, formation, and cohesion as a top priority.
How would they do that? Using federal power.
They suggest using tools like the tax code, for instance, getting rid of marriage penalties and welfare programs, or the tax system, which has been a longstanding conservative goal. Also, reinforcing work requirements for things like food stamps.
So it's less about direct financial aid for, say, childcare, and more about shaping policy to encourage or reinforce what they see as traditional family structures. That's a noticeable emphasis.
Exactly. It's about using government levers to promote a particular model of family life.
Okay. Now, what about the federal government itself? The bureaucracy, that's always a big target for reform ideas.
Oh, definitely. And this document signals some pretty significant changes they'd like to see in the civil service. There's a commitment stated to firing federal bureaucrats they see as entrenched or unfireable. Also, closing down agencies or bureaus they view as wasteful or, quote, corrupt. And then there's this phrase about actively working to muzzle woke propaganda across government.
Muzzle woke propaganda. That's very direct language.
It is. The stated goals behind all this are, 1, restoring what they argue is the people's constitutional authority over this administrative state, and 2, naturally saving taxpayer money.
Okay, that phrase, muzzling woke propaganda.
Yeah.
What might that actually look like in practice? And what could the effects be, say, on how government agencies communicate or operate?
That's a really important question. The document doesn't spell out the exact mechanics, but it strongly implies wanting to limit or remove certain social and cultural viewpoints from government communications, internal training, things like that.
So maybe changes to HR policies, agency guidelines?
Could be changes to training materials, public statements. The effects could be pretty significant, impacting how agencies talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. It definitely raises questions about that balance between official government policy and the the diverse views within the civil service itself.
Yeah, that seems like a potential area of friction. And national defense, always crucial. What's the core thinking guiding their plans there?
The main principle seems to be getting the military back to what they see as its fundamental warfighting.
Right.
This includes ending what they describe as the left's social experimentation with the military. And very clearly, the document states that defeating the threat of the Chinese Communist Party is the #1 priority for U.S. defense strategy, period.
Unequivocal on that point.
Absolutely. And alongside that, there's this expectation that U.S. allies need to step up, spend more on their own defense, take more regional leadership.
Okay, a very focused agenda there. Now, how do they plan to actually make these changes happen? The document talks about reshaping the White House structure itself. What are the key internal tweaks they're proposing?
Well, they put a huge emphasis on the chief of staff, describing that role as first among equals, and giving them dual responsibility for managing both the White House office, the WHO, and the broader executive office of the president, the EOP. The idea seems to be creating a really clear, streamlined organizational chart. Clear lines of authority, specific contacts for everyone else in government. Efficiency and accountability seem to be the drivers.
So, clearer hierarchy, tighter structure in the West Wing. What about the lawyers? The White House counsel's office, what's their envisioned role?
The document really stresses that the counsel's office should be an enabler of the president's agenda, not, a roadblock. It says subordinates need to be deeply committed to the president's agenda, and their job is to offer practical legal advice on how to lawfully advance that agenda. So the focus is less on can we do this, and more on how do we legally achieve this goal.
Finding the yes within the law.
Pretty much. It suggests they want a legal team that's really in lockstep with the administration's policy aims.
That definitely implies a specific kind of lawyer they'd be looking for. And then there's the staff secretary, maybe not a household name role, but sounds important in their plan.
Hugely important. The document calls the staff secretary the last substantive control point before anything hits the president's desk in the Oval Office.
Wow.
Yeah. This person is responsible for making sure all the paperwork is complete, organized, correct. But crucially, they also act as a gatekeeper. They control the flow, deciding who gets to weigh in on policy debates and when. It's a real nerve center for managing information and influence.
So, a powerful choke point, really shaping what the president sees and who gets heard. Makes sense if you want to control the agenda tightly. Okay, let's talk personnel getting the right people in. The Office of Presidential Personnel, PPO, seems key. What's their role?
The PPO is envisioned very explicitly as the personnel link between conservative organizations and the executive branch.
Okay.
Their job is to fill thousands of non-career political appointee positions, especially right at the start of an administration. And historically, the PPO has also had direct oversight of personnel files, even security clearances sometimes. It really underlines how important they view getting ideologically aligned people appointed across the board.
A very deliberate pipeline, it sounds like, to staff the administration with people who share that political outlet.
Exactly.
Then make sure all these pieces work together. They mentioned the big councils, National Security Council, National Economic Council, Domestic Policy Council. How do they see these bodies functioning?
They're seen as essential for coordination, right? Making sure everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet across the executive branch. Their job is to develop legislative priorities, make sure different agencies are aligned on big policy decisions, and generally keep things consistent with White House goals.
Managing disagreements, too.
Yes, very much so. Creating a structured way to hash out different views between agencies and then present clear options to the president when disagreements pop up.
Okay, let's shift to the money side. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB. Huge power there. What changes are floated for OMB?
One pretty significant idea is to break up the current structure. They have these 6 regional management offices, RMOs. The proposal is to divide those into smaller, more specialized units focused on specific policy areas.
And more political oversight.
Exactly. They want to increase the number of political appointees within OMB, specifically these roles called Program Associate Directors, PADs, and Deputy PAs. The goal seems to be exerting more direct political control and guidance over policy development and how it's implemented down at the agency level. More granular control, essentially.
More political eyes on the details, aiming for tighter alignment with the president's plans. Got it. The document also mentions bringing back something called Administrative PAYGO. What is that?
Yeah, administrative pay-as-you-go. It's basically an internal rule for the executive branch.
Got
It
it.
would require federal agencies, when they make a new discretionary spending choice, to find offsetting cuts somewhere else in their existing budget. It's meant to force some fiscal discipline within the agencies themselves, separate from whatever Congress does with the overall budget.
Hmm. An internal belt-tightening mechanism. Now, how does the National Economic Council, the NEC, fit into this wider economic picture?
The NEC gets a big role. First, in communicating the president's economic policy, working closely with the White House comm shop and speechwriters.
Right.
But also, crucially, advising the Presidential Personnel Office on who gets appointed to key economic jobs. That includes financial regulators. The explicit goal is to ensure these positions are filled not just by competent people, but by people fully committed to the president's specific economic priorities.
They even anticipate pushback.
They do. The document mentions potential resistance from career staff or even past political appointees in those agencies, which really highlights why they see this ideological alignment as so critical.
So the NEC isn't just policy formulation, it's personnel gatekeeping too, ensuring implementation aligns. And the vice president, what role is outlined for the VP's office?
The document basically says the VP needs a strong team of policy advisors, economics, domestic policy, national security. The idea is for the VP to be well-equipped to help the president push the agenda across the board.
And their NSC role.
Right, their statutory seat on the National Security Council is highlighted, underscoring that they're an integral part of national security decision-making.
Okay, let's pivot now to the federal bureaucracy itself, the civil service. This is often where the rubber meets the road for big policy changes and often a source of tension. What's their take on the current state of things?
Well, the fundamental belief driving their approach seems to be this phrase: whoever holds a government position sets its policy.
Personnel is policy.
Exactly. So managing personnel is absolutely top priority. They identify the key agencies here: the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, the Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB, and the Federal Labor Relations Authority, FLRA. These are the central bodies managing the federal workforce.
And what are their specific complaints or concerns about how these agencies and the civil service generally are working right now?
A major criticism is that the traditional merit criteria, ability, knowledge, skills, are, in their view, no longer the main factors driving recruitment, hiring, promotions. They also argue that federal pay and benefits have gotten way out of line, significantly exceeding the private sector, and that performance management is weak, that it's too hard to deal with underperformers. So the picture they paint is a system that's not rewarding merit enough, possibly overpaying, and lacks real accountability.
So a system they see as inefficient and not necessarily getting or keeping the best people or managing performance well. What specific changes do they propose involving the MSPB, which handles employee disputes, and the FLRA, which deals with unions?
Right. For both the MSPB and the FLRA, the document recommends bringing back executive orders from the Trump era that dealt with public sector unions.
Those were revoked later, right?
Yes, by the Biden administration. Those orders aim to limit the power and influence of federal employee unions. But the document goes further, actually raising a more fundamental question about whether public sector unions are even appropriate at all, echoing some historical arguments about potential conflicts with constitutional government. It signals a real desire to significantly change the government's relationship with its unions.
Wow, that would be a massive shift in federal labor relations. And OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, how does that fit into their strategy for managing the bureaucracy?
They want to elevate the OPM director, make it a cabinet-level position.
Really?
Yeah. The idea is to give the president, quote, direct supervision of the bureaucracy. It's about centralizing control over federal personnel management right at the top. It reinforces that personnel is policy idea, making sure they have politically aligned people to carry out the agenda.
Okay, let's switch gears to national security and defense again. We know China's the top priority. What other key pieces define their defense policy vision?
Well, besides the intense focus on China, they still emphasize maintaining a modern, strong U.S. nuclear deterrent. And keeping up robust counterterrorism efforts remains important, too.
And allies.
As we touched on, yeah, a clear expectation for allies to spend more, do more regionally. Plus, they want to streamline the whole process for selling arms to allies, make it faster.
Now, what about the actual service members, the people in uniform? What are the concerns and proposed fixes there?
The document expresses concern that military personnel are feeling overextended, undervalued, and insufficiently resourced. A key proposal, as we mentioned, is ending what they call social experimentation and just refocusing strictly on warfighting. They also want to boost the influence of the Defense Intelligence Enterprise, the DIE, in policy talks.
And security clearances. That's interesting.
Yeah, they propose reversing a recent change, moving the responsibility for most civilian security clearance investigations back to OPM, away from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, DCSA. They argue the current setup just added bureaucracy.
That's a notable bureaucratic shuffle they're suggesting. What about the specific military branches, Army, Navy, Air Force? Any targeted ideas for them?
For the Army, yeah, they flag challenges like budget pressures, readiness issues, recruiting struggles, and aging equipment needing modernization.
Okay.
For the Navy, the big push is investment and expansion, building up the fleet size to meet future threats, considering how fast naval tech is changing.
And the Air Force.
They urge the Air Force to adopt what they call a two-war force strategy, also to eliminate certain types of funding pass-throughs and get bigger budget increases each year to reverse what they see as a decline.
A two-war strategy? That's a specific benchmark.
It is. And there's even talk of exploring a dedicated Space Force Academy to grow talent for that domain.
A Space Force Academy. That definitely reflects the times.
Yeah.
What about cyber? That's obviously critical now.
Absolutely. The document acknowledges how fast cyber threats are evolving. It voices concern about bureaucratic silos within U.S. Cyber Command getting in the way.
So break down those walls.
Yeah, basically. Create a more unified, effective cyber defense. And then there's a really significant potential shift in strategy. They propose moving away from the long-held policy of not actively defending the U.S. homeland against Russian and Chinese ballistic missiles. That suggests wanting to really beef up domestic missile defense.
Wow, yeah, that would be a major change in decades of strategic doctrine. Okay, let's move over to the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Always a hot topic. What are the key changes proposed for DHS?
Well, a big criticism targets CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The document asserts CISA has been, quote, weaponized for censorship and influencing elections.
Strong claim.
Very. And they call for CISA to get back to its core mission, just securing cyber and critical infrastructure. The document also sees big opportunities to cut DHS spending.
How so?
Suggestions include privatizing TSA airport screening, maybe the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program too, reforming how FEMA handles emergency spending, getting rid of most DHS grant programs, and even removing all labor unions within DHS, citing national security reasons. These are all framed as efficiency and cost-saving measures.
Privatizing TSA screening, removing unions, those are definitely major proposals with big implications. What about specific agencies inside DHS, like USCIS dealing with immigration or FEMA handling disasters?
For USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the concern expressed is that it's become an open borders agency. They want it to return to being primarily a screening and vetting agency, focused on fraud detection and national security. Proposals include ending the use of parole authority except in very specific Secretary-approved cases, and restricting prosecutorial discretion in immigration enforcement.
So a much tighter rein on immigration processes.
Yes. Also mandating E-Verify for all government contractors and designating USCIS as kind of adjacent to the intelligence community. For FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the worry is it's overstretched, maybe compensating for states and localities not being prepared enough.
So push responsibilities back down.
Exactly. Refocus FEMA on only the truly catastrophic disasters and put more emphasis on federalism, state and local lead in disaster response.
Okay, so tightening immigration, refocusing FEMA. What about the intelligence part of DHS?
They recommend just eliminating the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis, INA. The argument is its work is duplicated by the main intelligence community and that it's been, quote, weaponized for domestic political purposes. They also suggest consolidating and reforming how DHS handles external communications.
Okay, let's shift now to the State Department. Foggy bottom, international relations. What's the big picture for America's role in the world, according to this plan?
The number one thing is personnel again, ensuring that the people at state share the president's vision and are actively working to implement that political agenda.
Using confirmations as leverage.
Yeah, the document suggests using the Senate confirmation process strategically, maybe even putting appointees into acting roles while waiting for formal confirmation to get them in place quickly. A huge focus, unsurprisingly, is the threat they see from the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, described as serious and dangerous.
What's the proposed response?
They advocate for an unambiguous offensive-defensive mix and a cost-imposing strategic response to counter China. There's even a proposal for the State Department and the National Security Council to develop a specific presidential mandate and something called an Article X for China to guide this whole strategy.
A very focused, assertive posture towards China. What about other parts of the world or international organizations?
Well, it stresses re-engaging with Middle Eastern and North African countries. A key goal there is preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons and curbing its wider ambitions. The approach to international organizations is pretty pragmatic, maybe transactional.
Also?
Basically, view them as vehicles for promoting U.S. interests. If they do that, fine. If not, consider pulling the U.S. out. There's also sharp criticism of the State Department's current structure and resources, calling it metastasized and saying it needs major reform to be more effective.
So a very results-driven, America-first kind of approach to diplomacy, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Moving on to the intelligence community more broadly, beyond DHS, what's the plan there?
The IC is described accurately as a vast, intricate bureaucracy. Its core mission: foreign intelligence and counterintelligence. The document calls for using intelligence authorities more aggressively against adversaries. Russia, Iran, North Korea, and especially China are named while still keeping up counterterrorism tools.
And leadership within the IC.
A key proposal is to give the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, more real power, budget authority, personnel authority, so they can actually lead the whole community effectively. It's even suggested the DNI should be the only cabinet-level intelligence official.
Centralizing power under the DNI.
Seems to be the idea. Other recommendations include broadening recruitment pools, speeding up the hiring process, and shifting resources away from CIA headquarters out into the field.
And the threats themselves, how do they see those evolving?
They really highlight that counterintelligence threats aren't just about government secrets anymore. It's technology, the economy, cyber, academia, and China is emphasized as the major player across these domains. To deal with this, they advocate for an obligation to share policy for cyber threat intelligence within the IC to try and improve collective defense.
Okay, let's quickly touch on a couple of specific agencies involved in international information. First, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM. What's the take there?
USAGM's mission is promoting freedom and democracy via news and information, right? Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, etc. The document sees it as having pretty serious internal problems.
Such as?
Mismanagement, disorganization, being ineffective, wasteful, redundant, even security failures that could make it vulnerable to foreign influence. It paints a picture of an agency needing a major overhaul and much tighter oversight.
Sounds like a strong call for reform. What about USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development? How's this work viewed?
USAID is described as suffering from bureaucratic inertia, programmatic incoherence, wasteful spending, and being too dependent on what they call a self-serving and politicized aid industrial complex.
Ouch.
Yeah. The document advocates making the promotion of religious freedom a core American value and integrating that explicitly into USAID programs. It also proposes standard policy provisions in all grants, specifically mentioning the policy on protecting life in foreign assistance, which relates to abortion funding restrictions.
Pushing specific policy goals through aid programs.
And also staffing. It stresses quickly filling key leadership jobs in the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation, DDI, and shifting money towards new priorities, like working directly with ethnic and religious minorities and faith-based groups.
Okay, shifting to domestic policy now. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, huge department covering healthcare, social services. What are the main criticisms and proposed directions here?
Well, there's very strong criticism of how the CDC and NIH handled the COVID-19 pandemic, concerns raised about data accuracy, mask policies, gain-of-function research risks, and potential financial conflicts of interest at those agencies.
Right, those were major points of contention.
Definitely. The document also flags HHS's stance on abortion access and advocates for reversing the FDA's approval of chemical abortion drugs and strengthening conscience protections for healthcare workers who object to certain procedures.
What about social policy more broadly?
There's a recommendation to move away from policies focused on, and I'm quoting here, LGBTQ plus equity, subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriage. The alternative proposed is policies that encourage traditional family structures.
And agriculture, food.
Emphasis on supporting farmers, removing barriers in the food supply chain. It denounces prioritizing climate change or equity over food production. There are suggestions to move the Food and Nutrition Service, that's SNAP, WIC, possibly out of USDA, and reform school meals to focus just on low-income kids, not the expanded eligibility.
So some potentially very significant and likely controversial shifts in public health, social welfare, and food policy. What about housing? The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, what's the focus there?
The document outlines HUD's basic functions: community planning and development, CPD, public and Indian housing, PIH, which run big programs like CDBG, home, public housing, housing vouchers.
Right.
A main point of concern seems to be HUD's Housing First strategy for tackling homelessness. The proposal is to end federal directives pushing grantees towards that specific approach. The Family Self-Sufficiency Program gets a mention, too. The overall sense is they want to rethink federal homelessness and housing strategies.
Okay. And a quick look at the Department of the Interior, managing public lands, resources.
The main discussion point there seems to be the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and specifically the controversies around its law enforcement powers.
Oh, yeah.
The document stresses the need for BLM officers to be well-trained, well-equipped, and operating under a clear professional chain of command, especially given how much federal land there is in states like Wyoming. So, focusing on professionalizing and clarifying BLM's law enforcement role.
Got it. Now let's turn to the Department of Justice, DOJ. Given all the political debate around law enforcement and the DOJ's role, this section probably has some significant proposals.
Oh, absolutely. The document calls for a really energetic, leadership-driven effort to refocus the DOJ strictly on public safety and defending the rule of law.
And criticisms of the current DOJ.
Yes, strong criticisms of the Biden DOJ. Allegations that it failed to protect citizens, became politicized, applied double standards. They cite examples like investigating parents, protesting at school boards, while allegedly ignoring attacks on pregnancy centers.
So what's the proposed new focus?
Making violent crime reduction the absolute top priority. Targeting violent criminals, career criminals, explicitly not parents involved in school protests. It also discusses ending the China Initiative, but stresses the need to vigorously protect constitutional rights, especially the First Amendment, rejecting limits based on political ideology. It references the 303 Creative Supreme Court case about free speech versus anti-discrimination laws.
And DEI initiatives.
Criticizes the creation of DEI offices and equity plans within DOJ, advocating for their reversal and strict adherence to non-discrimination law as written. The NSBA letter controversy involving parental protests is also mentioned critically.
Immigration enforcement.
Yes, stressing the need to prioritize immigration enforcement and issue clear guidance on that to U.S. attorneys. And, like in other departments, a big recommendation is to vastly expand the number of political appointees throughout DOJ, especially in key spots like the Civil Rights Division, the FBI, and the Immigration Courts, EOIR, and cutting back on personnel details seen as non-essential.
So a major reorientation of DOJ priorities, staffing, and enforcement focus. What about the Department of Labor, DOL workforce policies?
Discusses the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. One proposal is to amend it so collective bargaining agreements could treat federal employment laws essentially as default settings that can be negotiated away.
Interesting. But not all conservatives agree.
Right. The document notes some conservatives think directly antagonizing unions like that is maybe a strategic mistake. It also suggests encouraging innovation in unemployment insurance, maybe letting non-government worker groups administer benefits, leveraging federalism.
And retirement funds. China.
Yeah. Recommends DOL oversight to stop the Federal Employee Retirement Fund, the FRTAB, from investing in Chinese companies. Calls for Congress to legislate that too, and wants public pension plans to disclose the real market value of their assets and liabilities.
Okay, Department of Transportation, DOT. Roads, rails, air travel. Any big policy shifts proposed for managing the nation's transport systems?
Well, it critiques the Biden administration's fuel economy standards for cars. Proposes going back to limits set by Congress, focusing more on what's technologically feasible, supporting domestic auto production, and aiming for safer, more affordable vehicles.
And air travel.
Advocates for making flying cheaper, more available, boosting safety and competition, removing barriers to new aviation tech like drones or advanced air mobility. Specific ideas include supporting joint ventures by smaller airlines to compete better and reforming air traffic control.
How would they reform air traffic control?
Suggestions include possibly separating the FAA entirely from DOT, or at least separating the air traffic organization within the FAA, changing how the FAA is funded, operating it more like a business, maybe even using digital or remote control towers.
Okay, what about the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA?
Yeah.
Huge agency, complex challenges. What solutions are offered?
The document definitely acknowledges the VA faces massive fiscal, staffing, and infrastructure hurdles. It criticizes the Biden administration for, in its view, watering down the Trump-era Community Care Initiative, which gave vets more choice for health care outside the VA.
So they want to strengthen that.
Yeah, advocates for locking in the access standards from the VA Mission Act into law. Other proposals include setting hard targets for processing benefits claims faster, like an express 30-day commitment, using more private companies for disability exams, more automation in claims, using special short-term executive appointments for specific projects.
And dealing with the workforce.
It underscores that any big labor or civil service reform effort at the VA will need a really clear direction and strong political backing from the top to succeed.
Okay, turning to the economic agencies. Department of Commerce, Trade, Industry, Growth. What are the key proposals there?
Well, the document actually shows some internal disagreement on trade deficits. Some conservatives see them as a huge problem, offshoring hurting wages, weakening the industrial base. They push for reciprocity, decoupling from China.
But not everyone agrees.
Right, but regardless of that debate, the document stresses the need to immediately put politically aligned leaders into key financial and admin roles at Commerce, and making sure political appointees are talking directly with outside partners during the whole budget process.
Personnel again.
Absolutely. Placing committed political appointees and sympathetic career staff in key spots, especially the Census Bureau and the Chief Financial Officer's office, is seen as critical to push the administration's economic agenda.
And the Economic Development Administration, EDA, within Commerce, its role.
EDA's main job is described as investing in local communities for growth and helping with emergency relief. But it also notes the EDA had some technical and financial system problems during the CARES Act payouts, suggesting room for improvement there.
Let's broaden out to the financial sector and regulation. Any big shifts proposed in financial policy?
Yeah, one idea is creating new types of bank charters. These firms would have fewer restrictions on what they can do, less regulation, but in return, they'd have to hold more capital or retain more risk.
Less regulation for more capital?
Kind of. It also recommends repealing big chunks of the Dodd-Frank Act, especially the parts about the Financial Stability Oversight Council, FSOC, which monitors systemic risk.
Interesting. Other changes?
Suggests moving some law enforcement back to Treasury, specifically Coast Guard functions, and the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, which used to be under Treasury, and it advocates just eliminating the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA.
Okay, turning to Treasury itself, the nerve center of U.S. finances. What's the policy direction there?
Outlines Treasury's core jobs managing the economy, government finances. Mentions FSOC being housed there. For the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, the emphasis is on better taxpayer assistance and simplifying the tax code. Strong opposition to wealth taxes or giving the IRS more money specifically for enforcement.
Tax treaties.
Raises concerns about existing tax treaties potentially being exploited for identity theft or industrial espionage.
And the Export-Import Bank, XM, often debated. What's the view here?
It lays out both sides. The argument for XC, it boosts U.S. exports with financing help. The argument against, it doesn't actually create new exports, just substitutes for private financing that would have happened anyway.
Where do they land?
Notes the Reagan administration supported XCM, but criticizes the Biden administration for using it to push progressive policy goals. Suggests a desire to refocus it purely on export promotion if it continues to exist.
Okay. The Federal Reserve, hugely influential. What's the thinking on monetary policy and the Fed's role?
Explains how the Fed's mission grew to include not just stable prices, but also maximum employment. That dual mandate is always debated. Presents the view that easy money policies can actually cause recessions by inflating bubbles and messing up investment.
So, limit the Fed's power.
Discusses proposals to do just that. Ideas range from abolishing the federal role in money entirely to forcing the Fed to follow a strict predetermined rule for monetary policy. signals a real desire for less Fed discretion, maybe a more limited role for it in managing the economy.
What about the Small Business Administration, SBA, supporting entrepreneurs?
Describes the SBA's leadership and its main job. Advocating for small businesses, flagging harmful regulations, recommends a thorough review of all SBA loan and grant programs to see if they actually work. Based on that, maybe reallocate money or even cut the budget.
Concerns about its current direction.
Yeah, raises concerns about the SBA potentially getting into direct lending or supporting initiatives seen as progressive, implies a preference for the SBA to stick to advocacy and supporting lending through private banks.
Trade policy. Complex, contentious. What's the strategy outlined here?
Strong critique of the most favored nation, MFN principle, argues it hurt the U.S. via higher tariffs from others and led to chronic trade deficits, identifies the Chinese Communist Party's economic actions as an existential threat, points to mercantilism, industrial subsidies, forcing tech transfers.
That traps. IP theft.
Yes. Highlights the CCP's debt trap development aid model, intellectual property theft, using regulations coercively. Acknowledges the Trump administration had internal fights on trade specifics, but stresses the USTR position is absolutely critical.
Using trade strategically.
Advocates using trade to strengthen alliances, specifically against China and other threats. Interestingly, points to the U.S. Constitution creating a huge internal free trade zone as a positive historical example.
Specific policy ideas.
Suggests considering unilateral exemptions to the Jones Act, that law restricting U.S. shipping and maybe working to repeal it eventually. Admits inflation is mostly monetary, but says tariff relief could help a bit on the margins. Discusses the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, and says it needs refocusing back towards actual trade liberalization.
Okay, quick hits on some key regulatory agencies. Federal Trade Commission, FTC.
Criticizes what they see as the FTC overreaching its authority, focusing too much on progressive goals instead of just consumer protection and antitrust. Recommendation: get back to basics, work more with state AGs, modernize the definition of commodity for antitrust.
Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC. Derivatives.
Suggests needing clearer rules for digital assets like crypto and clarifying when exactly foreign swap trading platforms have to register with the CFTC. Reflects the changing financial landscape.
Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, created after the '08 crisis.
Advocates for structural reforms to make it more accountable. Mainly, tie its budget to Congress appropriations, not its current funding stream from the Fed. Wants more legislative oversight.
Federal Communications Commission, FCC, telecom, internet.
Proposals include getting rid of the legal immunity courts, gave online platforms under Section 230 for user content. Highlights need for better government coordination on spectrum allocation. Wants a more effective overall government telecom strategy. Suggests reforming the Universal Service Fund, USF, for rural broadband, and maybe revisiting net neutrality rules.
And finally, the Federal Election Commission, FEC, campaign finance.
Criticizes what it calls the FEC's overzealous enforcement of campaign finance laws, arguing it chills political speech protected by the First Amendment. Advocates DOJ should only prosecute really clear violations of the law. FECA notes the history of bipartisan FEC commissioner confirmations, implying a need for balance.
The document also touches briefly on decentralizing federal agencies versus keeping them centralized. What's the take?
It argues against breaking up federal agencies into lots of state-level offices, raises concerns about more bureaucracy, higher costs, and spreading what he calls a progressive government influence everywhere, even labels that idea Swamp 2.0. So the preference seems to be for keeping things more centralized federally.
And one last point on online platforms and consumer welfare.
Yeah, suggests the FTC needs better ways to measure consumer surplus, the benefit people get from platforms, and should consider behavioral economics to understand why some platforms get so dominant. Indicates a desire for a more sophisticated, data-driven approach to tech regulation.
So pulling it all together across all these different agencies, all these policy areas, you really see some consistent themes emerging from this mandate for leadership, don't you?
Absolutely. A clear desire to reduce the size, scope, and maybe the power of the federal government, a push to reassert what they see as core conservative principles, and a real effort to refocus government action back onto what they perceive as its essential constitutional duties.
That's a good summary. And this deep dive, we hope, has given you, the learner, that condensed but still pretty comprehensive overview of this mandate for leadership document. It really does offer a clear look into their vision and the kinds of policy changes they intend to pursue across the board.
It's definitely a potential blueprint for a significant shift in how the federal government operates. a real reorientation if implemented.
And that's our aim. The learner giving you that efficient knowledge download, that solid grasp of the big picture and the underlying thinking without you having to wade through hundreds of pages.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. If even, say, half of these proposed changes actually happened, what do you think the biggest consequences would be? The most far-reaching?
Yeah, think about the immediate impacts, but also the longer-term ripple effects on the economy, healthcare, national security, even individual rights. How might different parts of American life change?
It is a lot to think about, and we'd encourage you, if specific areas caught your attention, maybe DOJ or HHS or trade policy, go back, maybe even look at the source document sections. Think of this as just the starting point for your own deeper understanding.
Absolutely. A foundation to build on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.